Imagine it's midnight in a malaria-infested Carolina swamp in 1780.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you are knee-deep in freezing mud, clutching a heavy musket, and just like completely surrounded by a cloud of mosquitoes.
Sounds miserable.
Right. You haven't had a real meal in days, the money in your pocket is completely worthless, and you're about to launch a blind, desperate ambush against an army of your own neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds exactly like the climax of a historical thriller. But, we didn't pull that scenario from a Hollywood script.
No, we definitely didn't.
We extracted it directly from the stack of, well, seemingly mundane paperwork you sent us for today's deep dive.
Welcome to your custom deep dive. You handed us a really intriguing, pretty dense pile of genealogical sources.
Very dense.
Yeah, we are looking at ancestry profiles, 18th century handwritten land indexes, military rosters from the Revolutionary War, and this very cryptic financial ledger called South Carolina's stub entries to indents.
Right, and on the surface, I mean, it just looks like a pile of colonial administrative receipts.
Sort of a dry list of dates and names.
Exactly. But our mission today is to decode the mechanisms behind these documents. We are going to look really closely at one specific man in your family tree.
That's Solomon Stapleton, right?
Yes, Solomon Stapleton, who lived from roughly 1743 to 1808. And we're going to uncover how his paper trail reveals this incredibly visceral story of guerrilla warfare, total economic collapse, and just, pure survival on a colonial frontier.
Okay, so let's jump right into the earliest record you provided for Solomon. It's from 1760. He is about 17 years old, living down in North Carolina, and his occupation is listed as a chain bearer for a land survey.
A chain bearer, yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I'm assuming a chain bearer wasn't just like someone carrying jewelry around for rich people. What is the actual mechanic of this job?
Oh, it was incredibly grueling physical labor. Back in the 18th century, surveyors used something called a Gunter's chain to measure land grants.
A Gunter's chain.
Right. It was a literal iron chain, exactly 66 feet long, made of 100 heavy metal links.
Wow, that sounds heavy.
It was. So to map out the frontier, the surveyor would stand at a fixed point, and the chain bearer, which was young Solomon in this case, had to take the other end and just walk in a perfectly straight line through whatever was in front of him.
Wait, really? So if there's like a briar patch or a river or a dense thicket of woods in the way, he just has to drag 66 feet of iron straight through it.
He drags it straight through, pulls it taut, marks the spot, and then does it again, hundreds of times a day.
That is wild.
Yeah, but what's fascinating here is the secondary education this provides. For a 17-year-old kid who lost his mother at a young age and kind of had to make his own way, he is getting this intense, boots-on-the-ground education in frontier topography. He is learning how to read the deep woods, how to navigate without trails, and essentially how land is valued.
And that specific skill set really seems to pay off, because the next major document you sent us is an 18th century land index from 1771. Solomon is 28 years old now, and he secures a 100-acre land grant in South Carolina. But I have to ask about the location, because the grant is for a place called Gum Swamp.
Gum Swamp. Yeah.
That just does not sound like prime, breezy real estate to me. Why would anyone intentionally acquire 100 acres in a literal swamp?
Well, I mean, it sounds miserable to modern ears, but in the Craven County district, which is modern-day Marlborough County, swamp environments were actually highly prized if you understood how to leverage them.
Really? For what?
Cypress timber, for one. It was incredibly valuable for building, and if you could drain sections of the swamp, the soil was exceptionally rich for agriculture.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
But there's kind of a darker implication to this land grant. By settling in the Carolina swamps in the early 1770s, Solomon was positioning himself at geographical ground zero for a brutal conflict.
The Revolutionary War.
Exactly.
Now, looking at the military rosters you provided, I was honestly pretty confused by Solomon's service record. Well, when we think of the Revolutionary War, we usually picture the standard European style of fighting. Two armies in bright uniforms standing in a field, politely taking turns firing volleys at each other.
Right, the textbook image.
Yeah, but Solomon's unit doesn't operate like that at all.
No, they don't. The conventional war you're picturing did happen in the South, but it was an unmitigated disaster for the Patriots.
Oh, really?
Yeah. By 1779, Solomon is serving as a private under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Marion, and the records place Solomon's regiment right in the middle of the Siege of Savannah, which was just a bloody failure to retake the city from the British. And then the very next year, in 1780, the British lay siege to Charlestown, modern Charleston. The city falls, and the conventional Patriot army in the south is essentially captured or destroyed.
Wait, if the main army is entirely wiped out, what happens to privates like Solomon? Do they just, like, go back to their farms?
Well, some surrendered, sure,
Yeah.
but Francis Marion took the remnants of his forces and retreated into the brutal terrain they knew best, the swamps of the Petey and Santee rivers.
Ah, so this is where Marion earns the nickname the Swamp Fox.
Exactly. Because they couldn't fight set-piece battles anymore, they launched a ruthless, asymmetrical guerrilla campaign.
I still struggle to visualize how you actively fight a war from a swamp. You can't march an army through waist-deep mud and expect to win.
Well, you don't march an army, you weaponize the environment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this is where Solomon's background becomes so crucial. Men who spent their youth dragging surveyor chains through those exact woods, they knew every deer trail, every blind corner, and every marsh crossing.
Because he literally mapped it.
Exactly. They could strike and vanish before the British even knew what hit them. The sources you provided actually list specific tactical victories that relied entirely on this environmental knowledge, like the Battle of Blue Savannah.
Is that the battle where they faked a retreat?
Yes, Marion's forces were heavily outnumbered by a loyalist militia, so instead of standing their ground, they deliberately broke ranks and ran, just plunging deep into the woods.
But how do you stop a fake retreat from turning into a real panic? Once men start running from musket fire, it seems like human nature would just take over and they keep running.
Oh, it requires an unbelievable level of discipline and
Yes.
trust in the men next to you. They lured the loyalists into a blind, chaotic pursuit.
Okay.
And once the loyalists were drawn into a specific prepared choke point in the woods, Marion's men suddenly halted, turned, and unleashed a devastating, coordinated crossfire.
That level of coordination is just wild. This sounds more like a modern special operations mission than a colonial battle.
It really does.
But the battle in these records that really caught my attention was Tearcoat Swamp in October 1780. It reads like psychological warfare.
It absolutely was psychological warfare. Tearcoat Swamp was a midnight ambush. And if we look at the mechanics of 18th century weaponry, a black powder musket takes roughly 15 to 20 seconds to reload.
Right.
When you are hit by a surprise attack in the pitch black of a swamp, you literally can't see the enemy to return fire. You only see the blinding flashes of their muzzles.
Which has to be terrifying.
And that's followed immediately by a thick cloud of sulfurous smoke that obscures your vision even further. It induces sheer panic.
The records actually mention that immediately following the ambush at Tearcoat Swamp, a significant number of loyalists defected and joined Francis Marion's side.
Yep.
That tells you everything you need to know about how terrifying it was to be hunted by these guys in the dark.
It really does. And this raises a pretty important question about survival. Put yourself in Solomon's shoes. You are out in those swamps for months on end.
Freezing, starving.
Right. You are exposed to malaria, moving constantly to avoid detection, with basically no formal supply lines from a central government. How does a shadow army actually survive? How do they eat?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because fighting a shadow war is still incredibly expensive. And that brings us to a really unexpected figure in your sources, a man named John Smith III.
Yes, John Smith.
He's also listed as a private in the military rosters, but the records note that his main contribution was owning and operating a mill at a place called Bowling Green.
And in the context of a guerrilla war, a functioning mill is arguably more strategic than a fort. The audited accounts show Smith's mill acting as a vital safe house and logistical hub, actively supplying grain and provisions to Marion's brigade.
Okay, I am going to push back on this idea of a mill being a secret safe house.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because a colonial mill is a massive piece of infrastructure. It has a giant water wheel, it's incredibly loud, and farmers are constantly coming and going. How on earth does a noisy, highly visible building function as a secret base for a shadow army? Wouldn't the British just burn it to the ground?
Well, they absolutely would have if they could have reached it safely. But while the British controlled the coastal cities like Charleston, Marion's men effectively controlled the deep backcountry. The mill at Bowling Green was shielded by miles of hostile territory.
So they were safe out there.
Yeah, and you have to understand the logistics of food in the 18th century. You can't just feed an army raw wheat out of a field. It has to be harvested, transported, milled into flour or cornmeal, packed into dry barrels, and then distributed. John Smith's mill was the industrial engine keeping the soldiers alive.
And the records back up how important this location was. In June 1782, a force of 500 loyalists under Major Makajigani officially surrendered to Francis Marion, right there at Bowling Green.
Right at the mill.
The mill was the epicenter of the local war effort. But this creates a massive financial problem. John Smith is processing thousands of pounds of grain, and Solomon Stapleton is out there fighting. Who is paying them?
Well, the short answer is nobody. The Continental government and the state of South Carolina had absolutely no hard cash. There was no silver or gold in the treasury to pay men like Smith or Stapleton for their goods and services.
Which leads us to that very cryptically named document you provided, the stub entries to indents.
Yes.
For a long time looking at this, I couldn't figure out what an indent actually was. It just sounds like a bureaucratic filing error to me.
I know, it's a weird term. An indent was simply the state's official IOU. When John Smith handed over a barrel of flour or Solomon finished a term of military service, the state handed them a piece of paper that essentially said, "We owe you for this, and we promise to pay you back with interest once the war is over."
But the state was also printing paper money at the time, right? Continental currency. Why not just pay them in cash?
They tried, and it triggered one of the most catastrophic hyperinflation crises in history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the government printed so much unbacked paper currency to fund the war that its value just plummeted. By 1781, it took roughly 167 paper dollars to equal the purchasing power of just one silver dollar.
It's basically like doing an incredibly dangerous job, risking your life every single day, and your boss pays you in gift cards to a store that is actively burning down.
That's a great way to put it.
If you need to buy food for your family today, you can't wait 5 years for the store to rebuild. You have to sell that gift card to a guy on the street for pennies on the dollar just to get enough actual cash to buy lunch.
That captures the economic desperation perfectly. Soldiers and suppliers were starving for hard money, actual silver or gold, just to maintain their farms.
So what did they do?
Well, wealthy speculators from the cities recognized this desperation. They would ride into the backcountry and offer to buy these state indents from the veterans for a tiny fraction of their face value.
Taking advantage of them.
Exactly. The speculators took the gamble that the government would survive and eventually pay out the IOUs in full, which resulted in a massive transfer of wealth away from the people who actually fought the war.
So the people physically funding the revolution with their own grain and their own blood are taking huge financial losses.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these specific ledger entries prove that your ancestors weren't just carrying muskets. Families like the Smiths and Stapletons were the primary creditors of the newly formed United States. They financed the war effort with their personal property.
But if the government is completely broke and their paper money is worthless, how do they ever settle these massive debts with men like Solomon? Because looking at his timeline, in 1787, when Solomon is 44 years old, we see another land grant in his file, another 100 acres, right back on Gum Swamp in the Craven District.
Well, when you understand the economic collapse we just discussed, that 1787 land grant takes on a completely different meaning.
How so?
This wasn't just a standard real estate transaction by a farmer looking to expand his property. This land grant was Solomon's final paycheck.
Oh.
Yeah. The state government couldn't hand their partisan veterans a bag of silver, but they had an absolute abundance of raw land. They used land grants to systematically clear the books of the debts they owed to the militia.
So he gets compensated with dirt instead of gold. That actually makes total sense. Yeah. But there is one final piece of evidence in your stack of sources that totally threw me. It's labeled a cluster evidence exhibit. And it's literally just a list of names. Nathaniel Schwab, Benjamin Stone, Jacob Lee, William and Francis Simpson. Why do we care about a random list of guys?
Because they aren't random at all. This is the moment where genealogy stops being just date collecting and turns into structural historical analysis. Look closely at the military rosters for Francis Marion's company again.
Okay, let me pull them up. Wow. Schwab, Stone, Lee, the Simpsons. They were all listed as privates and sergeants in the exact same unit. They served right alongside Solomon in the swamps.
They survived the war together. But the real revelation is what happens after the British surrender.
Okay.
The civilian land records in your sources show Nathaniel Schwab acquiring land in the PD and Craven corridor.
Okay.
Benjamin Stone registers land and tax records in the same area. Jacob Lee gets grants in Chiraw. The Simpsons settle back on Gum Swamp.
Wait, they all moved to the exact same geographic corridor?
Yes. They fought together, got paid in land, and then built a community right next to each other.
That is incredible.
It is. This is what historians and genealogists call cluster evidence. In an era before government issued identification cards, social security numbers, or digital footprints, proving someone's identity can be incredibly difficult.
Because everyone had similar names, right?
Exactly. But this cohesive settlement community provides massive contextual proof. It strongly supports the hypothesis that Solomon Stapleton is the father of William Stapleton, because William doesn't just appear out of nowhere. He emerges directly from this highly specific, tight-knit network of connected veterans.
So, what does this all mean? To put it in modern terms, relying on cluster evidence is the 18th century equivalent of checking someone's mutual friends list on social media to verify that they are exactly who they claim to be.
That is a perfect analogy.
If I see you interacting with the same 5 people at work, and then those same 5 people are at your house for a barbecue, and then all 5 of you buy houses on the exact same street, I can be highly confident I've got the right person.
It functions exactly like that, and it highlights a fundamental truth about colonial life. Your identity wasn't a solitary, isolated metric. It was entirely defined by the community you fought alongside, the mill operator you traded with, and the neighbors you relied on to survive.
We started this deep dive looking at what seemed like a dry stack of paperwork. A chain-bearer record from 1760, a land grant for a swamp, a cryptic ledger of IOUs, and a list of neighbors.
Right. But by decoding the mechanics behind those documents, we uncovered the very real story of a teenager learning the brutal topography of the frontier.
Yeah.
We saw a partisan fighter surviving the psychological terror of night ambushes. We saw how a local mill propped up a revolution through a shattered economy, and how a brotherhood of veterans used their land grants to build a lasting community from the ground up.
It is an unbelievable narrative. And we've talked so much today about those indents, those state IOUs, that the soldiers were forced to sell off to speculators just to feed their families.
Which leaves us with the lingering, pretty fascinating question, because those IOUs didn't just vanish into the ether.
They didn't.
No. What we haven't touched on yet is the massive historical ripple effect of that exact paperwork. Years after the war, Alexander Hamilton deliberately chose to have the new federal government absorb and honor all of those state indents at full face value to build national credit.
Wait, really?
Yes. The very first securities traded on Wall Street weren't corporate stocks. They were the heavily discounted Revolutionary War debts bought up from desperate men like Solomon Stapleton.
No way.
Yep. The entire foundation of the American stock market was literally built on the trading of these specific swamp fighter IOUs.
That is a wild thought to end on. The financial engine of the modern world started with the literal receipts of guerrilla warfare.
Pretty amazing stuff.
Thank you so much for sharing your sources with us and letting us follow Solomon Stapleton's paper trail. Until next time, keep digging into those dusty files. You never know what kind of action movie is hiding inside.